Okay, so welcome everyone to another Breakfast with Birkbeck webinar. This morning we're joined by Olivia Hamlyn and Anna Hartnell to talk about environmental justice. So over to you for some brief introductions. Olivia, do you want to start us off with explaining who you are and what you do and teach at Birkbeck?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Aideen, and thanks for inviting me. So I'm Dr. Olivia Hamlin. I'm a lecturer at the law school, and I teach. I teach across. In terms of the the teaching that I do that corresponds with my research interests, I teach a couple of modules on environmental law, and I also teach a module called regulating technology because part of my research sort of engages with the law and technology side of environmental law, so technologies that can have an impact on the environment. So I teach that to a certain extent from the perspective of an environmental lawyer. Um, my research to date has been very much about risky technologies, so technologies that pose risks to the environment and how those are regulated. Um, but my most recent project has been, which is probably what I'll talk a bit more about today, has been on, well, I've just started researching it. It's on the government's new regime for environmental assessment, which it's calling environmental outcomes reports. So it's still a form of environmental assessment, but it's actually quite different. We don't know very much about the regime, so because it's very new, but that's what I've started researching recently and what I'm hoping to research over the next few years.
Fab. And Anna, do you want to come in and tell us who you are? What do you do? What do you teach?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Aideen. And yeah, so I'm a lecturer in contemporary literature in the School of Art, Creative Arts, Culture and Communication. And I run the BA Liberal Arts program, and I teach on that and also on the BA English, and our various literature and culture MAs. Um, and I guess in terms of the sort of teaching that's intersects with environmental issues, I've taught a kind of an MA course on globalization and the climate crisis, and just sort of thinking about the sort of way those narratives intersect. And we teach a module called Production of the Human, which is on the undergraduate program, which is very much about different frameworks for thinking about how we think about the human, including obviously the human relationship with the environment. And in terms of my own research, I mainly my kind of research focus is the United States, and thinking about how histories of racial and environmental injustice have kind of played out in various ways. So my first book was on the history of the Black Freedom Movement, and my second one was much more relevant to this seminar, was on the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and how that kind of played out in terms of the recovery, and in terms of sort of reimagining New Orleans culturally. But I was very much thinking about a kind of environmental justice lens for that book.
Amazing. These sound like, yeah, really important projects. So we've had several of these webinars before, and often it starts with thinking about terminology, and thinking about some of these words that we use. And justice feels like a term that might have really precise legal meanings, but also cultural and emotional meanings as well. So to start us off, can we discuss a little bit what environmental justice means for you in your field? Olivia, shall we go back to you to start us off on this one?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So lawyers, there are different ways of understanding environmental justice in the law, but I think about it as having two kind of main meanings. There's procedural environmental justice, and then there's distributive environmental justice. So procedural environmental justice would relate to what are your environmental rights. And we tend to think about those in terms of your right to information about the environment, your right to participate in environmental decision making, and your right to environmental justice. So that's your right to sue the government, for example, or judicially review government decisions regarding the environment. And those rights are protected in an international instrument called the Aarhus Convention, which was done in 1998. So we've had these legally protected rights in Europe for almost 30 years now. The EU is a signatory. Obviously, we're not part of the EU anymore, but the UK is also a signatory to that convention. So those are our procedural environmental rights. They don't, you can have those rights respected, but still have decisions that are bad for the environment. So it's about how the fairness of the procedures that you're involved in environmental decisions. The substantive or the distributive side of environmental justice is more to do with environmental outcomes. And I think Anna will probably know a lot more about this, because this is the understanding of environmental justice that developed in the environmental justice movement in the US. So it's to do with how good and bad environmental outcomes are distributed between and within communities, essentially. So where like environmentally damaging activities are cited, do they tend to afflict poorer, more vulnerable communities of colour, or are they evenly distributed throughout society? Or in this country, it's not just to do with sort of citing of undesirable environmental activities. It's also to do with things like, to what extent do you have access to green space? How easily can you get into nature? So the distribution of environmental goods as well as environmental bad. So that we would think about, in the law, we would think about environmental justice primarily in those two ways. So procedural rights and the distribution of environmental goods and bads across the country, across regions, or between communities.
Makes a lot of sense. Anna, what about in your field? What would your understanding of environmental justice be?
Yeah, so it was in some ways building on what Olivia just said about, I suppose, the distribution of environmental goods and bads. I suppose I think of, environmental justice as centering perhaps, more traditional social justice issues within environmentalism, and environmental activism and policy sometimes kind of being a field that has neglected social justice or even violated social justice principles. And so, yeah, as Olivia was alluding to, in the United States, the sort of environmental justice movement was really a kind of a grassroots development that various academics and centres of kind of research centres have built on. One example would be of communities that have suffered particularly from pollution, and therefore have kind of campaigned around particular issues in the way that sort of pollution has affected particularly disenfranchised, marginalised, low income, and often communities of colour. So one example would be in Louisiana, there's a strip of the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge that people have dubbed Cancer Alley. And it's a kind of a row of petrochemical plants and refineries. And there's been, that's led to huge amounts of water and air pollution and really high rates of cancer in those areas. So I guess the sort of the huge amounts of mobilization of communities around those issues. And then another example would be Flint, Michigan, with the lead poisoning of the water supply. And so there's a huge amount, I guess, of sort of mobilizing around issues that aren't often in particularly sort of Western environmental narratives kind of flagged up around humans being kind of human harm. So often environmental narratives are around kind of, Western environmental narratives often sort of separate nature from the sort of human world. So I guess environmental justice is much more about focusing environmental activism in urban contexts, just as much as rural ones. I think it's quite a different flavour. So I think it is, yeah, it's about sort of emphasising that environmental harms fall much more heavily on the shoulders of marginalised people.
Okay, interesting. So to take it back to the projects that you're both currently working on, Olivia, you mentioned that your work is focusing on environmental outcomes reporting. So how just are those reporting procedures? Who decides what gets measured? And yeah, how is that all working out?
So it's I mean, the answer is because this regime is so new, it's difficult to tell at this stage. So the framework for the regime was established in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023, but essentially it's a very small part of the Act. It's only about 16 sections. So there's very little detail in there about how the regime will actually work. And actually, most of the provisions in that part of the Act are sort of enabling powers. So they're essentially saying that this or that authority can make regulations to establish the details about this or that part of the regime. So we don't know very much about how it's going to work, even though, you know, the government finished its consultation on this 2 years ago and the Act was enacted towards the end of 2023. We don't have any regulations yet. So there's not very much that we know about how fair the procedures will be, or in fact, any detail about the procedures. There are concerns, though, about it from an environmental justice angle, and that is partly because the regime that it's replacing, which is the EU-derived regime of environmental assessment, so that includes environmental impact assessment, which will assess development projects, and also strategic environmental assessment, which assesses plans and programs and sometimes policies for their impact on the environment. So environmental assessment in general, or EA, that has been really instrumental in implementing our procedural environmental justice rights. So, and that's partly because it played a large role in implementing the Aarhus Convention that I mentioned earlier. So an example of the way it's done that is by being kind of implemented as a very participatory tool. So a key part of environmental assessment has been that it has to involve the publication of environmental information in the form of an environmental statement, and reasonably strong provisions for public participation. So an opportunity for local communities and the public more broadly to comment on the development on the environmental information, and had to have those concerns taken into account by the decision maker. So it's quite an important instrument for protecting procedural environmental rights. It's actually not that the sort of the distributive side of environmental justice is not that prominent in environmental assessment. And in fact, one of the flaws of environmental assessment is that it doesn't dictate a particular outcome. So you can have a perfect procedure, but there's no requirement for the decision maker to take the decision that's most protective of the environment. The idea is that they'll sort of be persuaded by the information that they have to hand to make an environmentally protective decision. But obviously that's not guaranteed. But regardless of that, it is an important instrument for protecting and ensuring our procedural environmental rights. So if that goes, and what we know so far about the new regime for environmental outcomes reporting is that public participation in particular seems to be weaker than it was or currently is in the existing EA regime. And if that's the case, if it's not protected to the same extent, if there are weaker consultation provisions, if there's less information available to the public to comment on, and this is one of the fears, if the sort of strength of the participation process and who's involved is at the discretion of the Secretary of State, which it seems it might be in this country, then the guarantees of a strongly participatory process are not necessarily going to be there. So it may be that the decision-making process is less protective of our procedural environmental rights. I'd say on the plus side, I mean, the whole point about this new regime is that it does focus on outcomes. So while it's not necessarily more substantive, it's not a sort of fully substantive procedure in terms of protecting environmental outcomes or the distribution of environmental goods and bads, because it still doesn't dictate an outcome. It still doesn't dictate a particular environmentally friendly decision in the end. The government is trying to make sure that environmental outcomes are achieved, but it's kind of in an indirect way. So it may be substantively a tiny bit better, although I'm skeptical about that. Current indications are that perhaps it's not as protective of our procedural rights as the current system, which it's replacing.
Okay, there's lots to unravel there. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about it later on. Anna, your current work is focusing on environmental justice and population narratives, right? So can you explain to us a little bit how those things get entangled? How do population narratives and climate concerns get enmeshed? And who's put at risk of harm through those discourses?
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, I guess there's a common assumption in environmentalist circles that has been debunked many times, but it keeps coming back. That population is a major, perhaps the major challenge for the climate crisis. And obviously, if we look at thinking about sort of debates, in the last couple of decades about the sort of veracity of climate science and the contributions that human activity make to the climate crisis. Clearly, if we accept that human activity is in part responsible, particularly the sort of burning of fossil fuels for the climate crisis, then obviously more human seems to be a greater problem. And that's the kind of logic of that argument. And if, we map population growth against fossil fuel use, again, from the Industrial Revolution, and particularly into the 20th century with the use of oil, there is a correlation, obviously, between population and use of fossil fuels. So in environmentalist circles, there's, has been for a long time narratives about so-called overpopulation, and that being a kind of a problem. But in more recent decades, it's quite clear that the biggest driver of the climate crisis or the sort of increased emissions in the last few decades, which have risen like exponentially compared to previous years, that economic growth is much more of a driver than population growth. So I guess the problem with and that people in countries where birth rates are currently actually falling in most places in Western Europe and in the United States, there is actually the amount of carbon emitted per head per person is far higher than in countries where birth rates continue to be high. So the argument about population and the argument that you do see in some environmental justice kind of campaigning, and you see it really mainstreamed in people like David Attenborough, who I'm otherwise a big fan of, is absolutely, he's the patron of Population Matters. He's been, banging the drum against, population growth for a really long time. And I think that the narrative you get is largely, Western environmentalists pointing the finger at some of the poorest people in the world, who, are, living in places where birth rates are still higher, and actually blaming them partly for a climate crisis that was not created by them largely, and they will be suffering the greatest consequences. So I think it's a real kind of example of environmental injustice at the heart of environmentalist narratives. It's got a really long history. I'm, interested in its narrative consequences and what it means to advocate as an environmentalist for fewer people being born, and what that means for human rights, what that means particularly for the human rights of women, and reproductive justice, and what it means for, people in the global south, what it has meant historically in terms of population control measures that were implemented all over the world in the 1970s and 80s, and which were supported and cheerleaded by many environmentalist activists. So there's a kind of long history of really problematic relationships with the environment. And I'm interested in the way in which that narrative kind of refuses to die, even though we have lots of evidence that it's not. It's not only is it a kind of a distraction from the real causes of the climate crisis, but it's the ethics of it are so dubious and are mired in this history of eugenic and racist thinking about population, about who has the right to have a child and who doesn't. So yeah, that's the kind of the focus of my research, is just thinking about that narrative and the robustness of that narrative and where it sort of lingers on, even though, as I said, it's continually debunked.
I mean, these are both such important projects to be working on, and it seems like a common thread is kind of in whose voices, what stories, what data gets heard or not, who gets framed as the cause of the problem versus an expert to speak on the problem. And I'm wondering if you've both got any thoughts on what needs to happen to kind of rebalance that. I mean, Olivia, you mentioned participatory processes and the difference between weak ones or strong ones. Is it about participatory processes, or is it about confronting something deeper about how we look at these issues?
Probably both. And I'd say they can help each other. So, I mean, in terms of just thinking back to EA environmental assessment more generally, there are different ways of viewing it. So some people would view it as an entirely technocratic process. So, you get your environmental consultants and they look at the impacts of a particular project on, bird populations or biodiversity or water quality, and they produce their scientific reports which go to decision makers, and decision makers may be their sort of technocrats as well, and they make decisions based purely on the on the scientific information presented. And there's very little role for public or participation or any kind of consultation with non-technical experts. Another way of looking at it is, as I mentioned, this kind of very open participatory process. And we don't really have either. I think it's what we have at the moment is a combination of all sorts of different ways of understanding EA. But a fundamental part of it, as it's understood in this country and in the EU, is that it should be very participatory. And that's partly important because of an understanding that knowledge doesn't reside in just one place. So the more people we have involved, the more knowledge, perspectives, values we can take into account in our decision. And that's good for the fairness of the procedure, but it's also allegedly good for the final decision, because you have a decision that's based on a broader range of information. So but that's obviously, that's difficult to achieve because it's an extremely, like, hearing as many voices as possible is extremely difficult. It's time consuming. How do you get hold of hard to reach communities? That requires a lot of effort, which, cash strapped authorities are going to struggle to do in every process. So I'm a proponent of as much and as broad a public participation as possible and as ambitious a process as possible. And I think that can help us open up these broader questions that you mention, Aideen. So the more perspectives you can canvas, the more maybe you can get to what the heart of an issue is or what people really care about. I think the problem with the structure of EA at the moment is that often, so there's sort of a choice between upstream consultation, so early on in the decision-making process when it's at the sort of policy or planning level, and more downstream, so later on in the process when it's to do with consulting on a particular project. And this is a sort of tension that you see throughout the regulation of technology, really, because we are often talking, EAs often are about kind of wind farms or building a nuclear facility or whatever. It's essentially about how do we regulate technology here. The problem with consulting very late is that options are closed, alternatives are closed. It's too late to really kind of address like big policy issues. It's too late to change a project to make it more environmentally friendly. However, if you consult early on in the process, the questions are really open, they're abstract, it's difficult to sort of understand what, the policy or plan really relates to. It's difficult for the public or stakeholders to really grasp what they're being consulted on, alternatives. So there are problems with doing it at every level. Which means that, if we're talking about kind of really trying to reframe questions or think about new ways of doing it, there's sort of it's difficult to find the right time to do it. I think it's often because it essentially comes back to we need to reorganize our economy and we need to completely reorganize society. And it's very difficult to do that in, response to a policy or a project or a particular plan. So I agree that it needs to happen, but it's very difficult to find a way to do that.
Yeah, it's it's complex for sure. Anna, you mentioned as well this kind of theme emerging of like the discourses or the narratives that refuse to go away. I'm wondering, is there anything in your research so far that is giving you any insights or any sort of direction in terms of how do you shift those narratives or how do you, yeah, change that?
Yeah, yeah, I'm not sure really. As I said, yeah, excuse me. Part of the excuse me, part of the research is about, the fact that this narrative hasn't gone away. We have plenty of evidence for the fact that, um, the use of resources and particularly energy in, you know, for example, sub-Saharan African countries where birth rates are still quite high, are a tiny fraction of what someone in a Western country uses, and there's so much data on this. So the story has been out for quite a while. But yeah, and I guess I'm interested in why it persists, and I'm particularly interested, I guess, in the way that, and obviously, as I've mentioned before, you've got the kind of this really this spectacle of like sort of Western environmentalists kind of blaming the people who have not caused this crisis and are suffering its worst effects already. And what I'm interested in is, you've got, various, as I mentioned, David Attenborough, other people who have long been worried about, population growth, for people like Bill Gates. And, in this country, we've got like the King, King Charles, is very concerned about this, has been for a long time. So, but I think what I'm interested in is the fact that it's not just a kind of a more rightward leaning narrative. It pops up in progressive circles. It's been really prominent in the work of the eco-feminist Donna Haraway, who has, written about the desirability of a few billion fewer people on the planet. recently, and I just think I'm kind of interested in thinking about why that pops up in supposedly or apparently progressive spaces, and what makes way for that kind of thinking. So I absolutely think the narrative needs to be challenged. I think different voices need to be heard, but I kind of think that it's not that different voices need to be necessarily heard on population. It's that we should be talking about other things entirely. Like we need to be talking about reproductive justice. It strikes me that advocating for more, which is a kind of big part of the contemporary horizon at the moment, more people or fewer people, does not ever align with reproductive justice principles. Um, and therefore we need to be talking, we need to be talking about poverty, we need to be talking about energy use, we need to be talking about wealth, and we need to really not be talking about population. But I don't really have any answers on how to change that conversation, really, apart from keeping on sort of challenging it and exploring it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And one final question, to wrap things up. Is there a risk, or maybe you already see this happening, which I suspect could be the case, of environmental justice becoming a bit of a buzzword? And if so, how do we kind of prevent that and keep it grounded in the experiences of those who are most affected? Who wants to jump in?
I can have a crack at it. I think there's a risk with loads of terms that have very broad meanings, and sustainability or sustainable development is probably the worst culprit. And plenty of people have argued, and I don't know, I wouldn't take a strong position on it, but I certainly have sympathies with this position, is that it essentially doesn't mean anything. Anyone can claim that anything contributes to sustainable development. I think in terms of environmental justice, it could mean loads of different things to loads of different people. I don't think it's quite as bad as sustainable development. But I mean, in the US, my understanding is that it does have quite a specific meaning, which is often related to what are called LULU, so locally undesirable land uses, and where they're cited, and are they cited in the more vulnerable communities as opposed to sort of more evenly spread, according to different better off communities. In the UK, though, it's much broader than that. So as I mentioned before, it's really about the distribution of all environmental goods and all environmental bads. So there are benefits to having a much broader understanding of environmental justice, because we can consider distributive questions more holistically. But I think it does risk becoming sort of too broad to have much meaning, and ends up just encompassing more and more and more problems and issues and questions, so it can lose its focus. So beyond that, I don't really know. I think there are arguments for having a much narrower, more focused meaning, and having a much broader meaning. I think that what I would say, and this is often my feedback to students when they write essays on environmental justice, is to be really clear about what type of environmental justice you're talking about. So in the law, coming back to the distinction between procedural and distributive, and there are other types as well. There's restorative environmental justice, and I think people have come up with different ideas of it too. So, be clear about what model of environmental justice you're really thinking about, and be clear about how you're using it. So rather than just sort of flinging around buzzwords, there is, it can be a really useful concept and tool if you're clear about how you're using it and the way you believe it should be interpreted, while acknowledging that it's interpreted differently by other people. I think that would be my suggestion for trying to wade through the mess.
Wading through the mess, love it. And
The
Anna,
mud.
last comment to you. Do you feel like it's at risk of being a buzzword?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it is a buzzword, and it's obviously really widely used. And I think that's in some ways really inevitable. Like, I agree with what Olivia just said about, the kind of wading through the different interpretations and kind of arguing for your particular interpretation. Because I think that's in some ways it can only be an aspirational term. And if it becomes anything other than that, like there's a problem anyway. Like it can't, so it's always it needs to be debated and up for grabs. And once we've kind of settled on what these terms mean, in some ways we kind of might lose the substance of them. So I feel like, as with any, like, it's a bit similar to debates about what is feminism, what is anti-racism, what does that really constitute? People obviously disagree. And I think so. I think those debates are really important. But yeah, I guess my understanding from the US perspective is just that kind of, in some ways, I think of environmental justice as being a bit of a critique of much mainstream environmentalism, and about putting humans at the center of the story as well, and thinking about the sort of environmental harms that are done to people as well as planet, and thinking about that in tandem and not losing sight of that, because I think, as I said, I think it's particularly Western traditions of environmentalism that have tend to forget that and think about this kind of pristine out there nature that needs to be preserved and conserved, and not worrying too much about humans, and seeing humans as actually quite sort of, destructive by nature just by existing, which is part of the problem, I think, of the population narrative that I've been talking about. But I think so. I think yes, it has become a buzzword, but it's an important idea, and we need to keep talking about what it might constitute.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and experience with us. We'll stop recording now and hear some questions from our audience as well. But thank you so much, Anna and Olivia.